Hi, welcome back. My name is Eleanor, and I'm going to just talk generally about what I've been doing this past week, what I've been reading and thinking about. First of all, prose poetry. I did promise a couple of my subscribers to talk about it. And since then, I've been dipping in and out of this book, which I recommend. If you're interested in reading a selection of prose poetry through the ages, this is excellent. The Penguin Book of the Prose Poem, edited by Jeremy Noel Todd. His introduction is very helpful, and I really like the way he sets out the poems by year, and he starts in the present moment, which was for him 2017 because this was published in 2018, and then he goes backwards all the way, all the way back to the mid 19th century. So I think that's an excellent way to start to get a feel of what prose poetry can do and what it's about. As far as the definition of prose poetry, anyone will tell you that the definition of poetry itself is very difficult. And so, of course, prose poetry is even more difficult. I'm always reminded as well of the wise words of the poet Sean Singer, who says that we must always remember that poetry is not a turf war. There is no turf. So, things I feel confident to say about prose poetry. It's poetry but without the lineations. So it's got everything else going for it to make a poem, except the poet just doesn't want to have that raggedy end of the line. That's all it is, really. And that also means that the poet has to use other tools in their toolbox to get certain effects that they want to have with their readers. So they don't have that space to work with, that end of the line. So, different poets will use different techniques. One particular technique that comes to mind immediately is making the subject matter unusual, difficult, strange, because when you're writing a prose poem, you are working with the expectation that the reader has for it to be prose. So even though you're going to read a prose poem because it might be in a book of prose poetry, you're looking at this, what looks like prose, and you have an expectation of certain subject matter. So the poet is using that to their own effect. And I'm thinking specifically about a poet such as Russell Edson, who really uses extraordinarily strangely illogical and somewhat, I suppose you might say, surreal narratives within his prose poems, together with certain linguistic quirks, so as to create a very specific world that wouldn't read the same and wouldn't feel the same if it had lineation, because it wouldn't be playing with the expectations of prose and expectations of the narrative. If you're interested in one of his poems is in the Penguin Book of Verse, but if you're interested in just reading a little bit more about him, I do recommend a somewhat old essay, and the essay came out in 2004, but it's still remarkable. It's still online. It's at the Believer. I'll leave all the links. It's by Sarah Manguso, who you may be familiar with, and she talks about why she loves the prose poems of Russell Edson. So that's one I really recommend. Another very interesting way of dealing with a poem that doesn't have lineation is something that I've been reading about a great poet called Rosemarie Waldrop, and I've only just started to read about her, so I'm in no way telling you that I'm an expert. I'm just explaining what I've been researching and what I've been looking into and what I'm interested in. And there's a great article in the Poetry Foundation site, and this is relatively recent, 2021, called Mind the Gaps, and it's written by Ryan Ruby. in a very interesting way. And he talks now, I have a feeling this is much more complicated than I, am understanding. But basically, Rosemarie Waldrop has two metaphors, he writes, for what she does in a prose poem. One is curvature and the other is gap gardening. So curvature, if I understand correctly, refers to the way she bends and manipulates syntax so as to change meanings and bring 1, 2, 3 meanings in at the same time to a sentence. And gap gardening is about her use of punctuation. Again, blurring the lines of meaning that might be done in a non-prose poem through lineation. So it's fascinating to look into prose poetry because it makes you realize the power of the line and also the power of syntax and punctuation, that the potential that's there in the syntax and punctuation when you don't have the line to fall back on. And then there's this idea that in the same article that Ryan Ruby brings up, and it's talked about a lot, and I'm sort of getting my head around it. The idea of time being different in a poem as compared to prose. I think that's really the most fascinating idea for me because it points to the difference there is between reading a piece of prose and reading a piece of poetry. And it's in both the way time is created within the poem and also within the mind of the reader. So when you're reading prose, you're generally expecting, unless it's a highly experimental work, which points to it being possibly poetic, generally prose is forward moving and there's a narrative and there's a beginning, middle, and an end. And that's your time structure. With a poem, the reason why reading poetry is so odd and I would say difficult, I find almost all good poems difficult, is that you are reading it in a different space and time than prose. It's almost as if the poet is a puppet master of time, and you can't help but stop and go back and then go forward and then go back to the middle and then go start again. It's not merely rereading a poem. It's the way the poet is pointing you towards the different meanings, feelings, and thoughts that they want you to have. So it's almost as if sometimes it feels like your car has stalled halfway through a poem. Or maybe it feels like you've actually turned around several times, spun around, or you're going backwards, or you've had to change your direction 180 degrees or something like that. There's a space and time in the poems that's completely different. And what I'm looking at now for the future is trying to see how I can help myself to read more poems, because that's what I really want to do. I'm finding it very hard to form that habit. And I think it's because I'm used to forming the habit of reading prose and I'm not used to the habit of reading poetry because of that time-space difference. So I found that to be very interesting. Next, I wanted to talk about a video I made. When did I make it? A while back, about Miranda July. Her book, All Fours, is a finalist for the U.S. National Book Awards. And she's very excited, and she wrote something on Instagram that made me really think a little bit deeper about how she sees her own work. And she said that this award meant a huge amount to her because fundamentally she was concerned that she would be, I think, ostracized, if I understand correctly, or perhaps attacked in some way within the literary community because she was talking so openly about perimenopause. And I completely disagree with that idea, because I think that actually perimenopause is being talked about more and more now. I mean, even Naomi Watts is writing a book now about it, I mean, for goodness sake. And also it's become a bit of a trend to talk openly about it as well. I think maybe what she's feeling is this idea that people, generally readers, judge female characters more harshly than male characters, especially if they seem to be making questionable or unusual decisions. But then I saw that Miranda July was being interviewed by Esther Perel. Esther Perel is a psychotherapist, and she's been working in the public sphere for a long time, but it's only recently that she's been connected with a larger marketing strategy, and that has brought her to a larger global audience. And so the minute I saw that Miranda July was going to be getting together with Esther Perel and talking about, the middle-aged woman and desire, alarm bells started for me, because I see snake oil, I see marketing strategy, I see dollar signs, and I don't see much about literature, and I don't see much about art. And what I really loved about All Fours is that it's a work of art. It's not a memoir. It doesn't purport to be nonfiction, and it's brought up so many different ideas, and in such a witty and comedic and ironic way. I was really surprised to see that this was going to be a podcast episode. So I listened to the episode, and I was very, very disappointed, because I felt that Miranda July was pandering to this idea that perimenopausal women, middle-aged women, let's just say, are all the same, and they have certain issues with desire, and that feeds in to a workshop that Esther Perel is spruiking, by the 3-part video program. I didn't want to listen to the podcast episode again, but I wanted to make sure that I was understanding things correctly. And luckily there is online an excerpt that's transcribed from the podcast. I'll leave a link. It's on the cut. And so I read through that, and yeah, that confirmed to me that this is sadly the way Miranda July, this is the path that Miranda July decided to go on. She doesn't talk at all about her art, about, the book as a piece of literature. She's kind of coyly pointing out that, yes, there are some bits of her own life in there, but it's not all, and there is some imagination. And then they talk a lot about different therapeutic methods to help couples and men and women, which is all very well and good, but I don't see how that is at all connected with fiction. And I really detest any connection between a work of art and a work of therapy. I mean, look, if a work of art helps you, that's absolutely fine, and so be it. That's amazing. But I don't think that any true artist is thinking of helping someone through their story, I think that's very simplistic. It's banal, and that really put me off. As far as the last video I made about the Chéri and end of Chéri translations, I do want to say that I do recommend the Rachel Corot translation above the others. And in her introduction, she actually talks in very detailed, wonderful way about how she went about trying to translate Colette's writing, and very politely points out the difficulties she had with Roger Senhouse, who was actually the translator that I originally read before I read Rachel Corot. There is another translator called Paul April, who came out with the two Chéri novels almost at the same time as Rachel Corot, and that's through the New York Review of Books, and that's fine. It's a fine translation. I read half of that, but definitely I'm a non-French speaker, so it's not as if I can say, oh, it's closer to the French, but for a reading experience, the Rachel Corot one is here, and all the others are here. So, lastly, I read The Magician of Lublin by Isaac Bashevis Singer. It happened to be on my bookshelf because it's almost the same size as A Break of Day by Colette, which I read previously. And so it reminded me that I wanted to get back into Isaac Bashevis Singer. I really liked a few of his short stories that I read a while ago. I like the way he uses the supernatural and sort of, surreal aspects of New York at a certain time in history. This one is set in a 19th century Poland and follows the adventures of this magician who is struggling with the idea of good and evil. He's trying very hard to be good, but is not doing very well. And then at some point, he realizes that he needs to repent, and it's the kind of story that I'm extremely happy I finished, because it was a bit of a slog until 2/3 of the way through. It was a little bit boring, and the female characters were not fully rounded, but I can see what Singer was doing, because by the end he had created a kind of a world, a symbolic world, I suppose, that is staying with me now and affecting me really a great deal, because it's a world I can see through the images, but the meaning of it is to do, fundamentally, it's about how do you deal with being human. You make mistakes, you are sometimes evil, you try to be good. What happens afterwards? How do you make up for that lost time? How is it that you want to punish yourself? How do you view yourself? And are you certain that things that you've done that are terrible are really as terrible as you think? It's a great, complex book that on the surface seems facile. So I do recommend it. And it did, the particular book that I was reading had 3 illustrations by Larry Rivers, and I'll put them up here because they really added a lot to the reading of the book, a lot. So I think that is it. That is what I've been thinking about this week. I hope you've all had a good week, and I look forward to seeing you next week. All the best, and please don't forget, the only real property is the property of the mind. Bye-bye.